Hospitals are supposed to be places you go to get better. Clean sheets, antiseptic smell, machines that tell you exactly what's wrong and how to fix it. But spend enough nights inside one and you start to notice another kind of traffic. Things that don't have charts, things that arrive without an attendant. By the time you hear the first whisper through a curtain or see the impossible in a brightly lit restroom, the ordinary rules feel thinner. Liminal places do that. They put life and death on either side of the same hallway, and sometimes the space between becomes someone else's waiting room. I've collected a lot of these accounts. Nurses, orderlies, security officers, patients, family members. I'm not here to prove anything. These are reports. What I can promise is what they promise each other in the break room. Some of these will sit with you after the lights go out. So get comfortable. Maybe keep a light on. And if you want more of these sorts of stories early, or bonus accounts we couldn't fit here, there's a Patreon link in the description. 1. The Vanishing Walker. It's a small hospital restroom off the surgical waiting area, tile floor, a few vending machines in the hall, a fluorescent hum that never really turns off. One afternoon, a young woman went in, sat in a stall to cry. Her mom had been in emergency surgery. Through the slatted gap, she saw an older woman with a walker shuffle in and take the next stall. The woman with the walker made a faint cough. Then there was the sound of the walker tapping against tile, as if someone were leaning on it while adjusting a coat. The young woman finished and stepped out. The joint stall that had been occupied was empty. No old woman, no walker. The walker was gone. No one in the hall, nothing tucked into corners. 2 women in the waiting area later reported the same. They had watched the older woman enter the restroom, heard the tapping, and then nothing. One said, half joking and half wide-eyed, "It couldn't just wheel out silently. Those things make a racket." There are mundane theories. Maybe someone left quickly and pulled the walker. Maybe it was a set decorator from a TV crew who had left a prop. Still, the witnesses were certain of the timing. The physical impossibility of a metal walker vanishing in a bright, busy corridor is what stuck with them more than any superstition. A hospital has cameras in most public spaces. They checked. The footage showed the young woman entering, the older woman closing the stall door, and then a blank frame where both of them should have been. The only sound on the clip was the fluorescent hum. The family later told me they carried the image of that empty stall around with them for months, like a little question that refused to be resolved. It's the kind of detail that sits in the room with you, an ordinary object, gone, with witnesses who are just starting to accept that the world inside hospitals isn't always the one they learned about in health class. 2. The ER curtain voice and the kids. Small, rural ER, dim lamps instead of harsh overheads, 2 beds separated by the thin privacy curtains you can see through if you stand close enough. A young nurse, new early 20s, was midway through a 12-hour shift when she heard it. A raspy, childlike voice from the other side of the curtain. It said, plain as air, "I'm scared." She pulled the curtain back. Empty bed. No patient, no family, only the slow drip at the IV pole in the neighboring space and the smell of rubbing alcohol. She told the senior nurse on duty, who didn't flinch. "Oh, the kids like to come out to play at night," the older nurse said, like filling a coffee mug. By the time the young nurse found a doctor to check the charts, there was no record of anyone being admitted to that bed at that hour. The chart said it had been closed for cleanup. This kind of normalization is its own kind of creepiness. When someone whose job is to catalogue human life treats a voice in the dark as part of the job, it suggests there's a calendar for these things, nights when something comes by and knocks on the fabric between beds. The rookie nurse reported that she stopped sleeping properly after that. She found herself listening to vents and curtains, waiting for little cautious syllables to come from the seams. 3. Fever dream. Visit from K. This one comes from a woman who remembers it as though through a slightly blurred film. feverish, small, the world leaning in. She was a child, sick in bed, sheets sticking to her skin. Around midnight, she says a woman came in, bandana, denim jacket, the smell of cigarette smoke under something sweet. The woman sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "Everything's gonna be okay," smoothed the child's hair, and left. Years later, after the storyteller's mother had a vehicle accident and died, a distant aunt called and said something odd. A neighbor named Kay, someone who used to babysit, who'd been seen around the neighborhood for years, had died just hours before the child's feverish memory. The narrator, then an adult, found the coincidence too precise to dismiss. She describes the visit not as a terrifying apparition, but as a warm, ghostly consolation that predated news by days. Was it a fever dream, a precognition, or a local woman whose rounds reached into sleep? She says she can't tell, only that the memory holds the exact smell and the exact softness of the hand on her forehead. A lot of near-death or fever stories have this pattern. The visitor who comforts rather than frightens. Witnesses often walk away, unsure whether to be grateful or unsettled. The nuance matters. Comfort, whether human or otherwise, complicates our assumptions about intent. 4. Joe and the tall man. Joe was a long-term hospice patient, the kind of man who'd spent enough years in shoes to have a set of stories behind him. He was gentle-minded, chipper in a way that made nurses soften up. Over the course of a week, Joe began telling the same detail at odd intervals. "There's a tall man in all black just watching. He stands at the end of my bed." He'd point, bloodshot eyes tracking the doorway. Staff checked the room, found nothing but machines and the slow, steady line of his respirator. When Joe died, his niece came by, and she said with that small, brittle laugh people use when they don't know what else to do with grief, "He used to do things you wouldn't believe. Beat men half his size in pool halls, lied to get out of parking tickets." The niece's confession reframed Joe's fear. Maybe he had a conscience-made figure, some personification of judgment or the past keeping tabs on him. But that interpretation sits uneasily when multiple nurses reported seeing a shadow at his door. Nothing detailed, just a height, a darkness that was more absence than shape. The moral muddiness of Joe's life complicates what the witnesses made of the tall man. For some, the figure read like a remnant of guilt. For others, it read like a predator waiting for an opportunity. The staff mostly shrugged and wrote "patient anxious" in a file. The watchful presence outlasted Joe by a couple of nights. 2 nurses said they felt watched down that wing long after he was gone. 5. The shadow with a sister's face. There's a particular kind of nightmare where someone you love is an imposter. Your sister smiles, but something in the smile is wrong. A nurse on a step-down unit told a story that lands on that exact sharp edge. She was sitting by her father's bedside through the night. At around 3 in the morning, a silhouette, tall, thin, stood in the doorway, and then, impossibly, the nurse said she could see a face inside the darkness. Her sister's face, as if projected onto shadow. The figure mirrored a memory so perfectly she called out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" She says she said it in a kind of automatic defense. "In the name of Jesus, get behind me," because that's what her mother taught when the house got too strange. The shadow receded, folded in on itself, then surged like a tide and filled the room with a pressure that made her ears pop. When she woke later, her hands were clasped over her father's chest, as if to protect him. She didn't know why she had done it. What unsettled her afterward was not simply the mimicry, but the sensation of being tricked into trust. The figure used intimacy, the shape of a sister, to lower her guard. Most hospital encounters with mimicry are small and cruel like that. A lullaby from an empty room, a hand that feels like your child's, and is, in fact, nothing you can name. The nurse left the unit and took days off, not because she feared for her father's safety, but because she feared how easy the figure had found it to borrow a face she loved. 6. Nonny and Papu. Appearances in ER. College age, running a fever and losing a fight with sepsis, a patient remembered 2 visits that were less dramatic than the others, but somehow heavier. The first was a soft, grandmotherly presence that sat at the bedside and smoothed the patient's hair. Later that same night, a man, broad-shouldered, stoic, entered, one the patient later identified as someone who looked a lot like her grandfather. The family swore they had no one in the waiting room at those hours. The staff reported that the patient's vitals stabilized in a way they couldn't quickly explain, and an attending nurse murmured a prayer by the bed. Family members often interpret such visitations as either a heavenly comfort or a hallucination. In this story, the family took it as comfort. They told the patient and then told each other, and the hospital staff said, "Those visits happen," in the same tone you use to explain that the heater sometimes clicks at night. The patient recovered in stages, enough to be discharged a week later. For the family, the memory became a kind of talisman. The image of Nonny's cardigan and Papu's hand on a shoulder, simple human things that felt like someone saying, "You can go now." These stories are where hospital folklore and faith overlap. In the staff room, explanations are quieter, a surge in endorphins, a fevered brain, a comforting narrative people give each other when the machines are doing too much work for their peace. 7. Donna's ICU patient and the butterflies. ICUs are coded to be both clinical and, oddly, theatrical. Machines blink, family members cluster, and the air tastes like sterilizing agents. A nurse named Donna described a patient close to death who, in his final hours, became fixated on small things that weren't there. Butterflies, he called them. The man followed the air with his fingers, smiled in a way that made Donna remember the last line of a poem, then passed peacefully. Donna didn't use the word angel. She said butterflies, the way someone might report an unexpected compliment. It's the specificity that matters. The man described a color and a motion, and everyone around him noted a softness in his face they had not seen in days. Sometimes the simplest imagery carries the deepest weight. For Donna, it was enough to tip the scales from professional detachment toward belief of a private sort. She started bringing a little knitted butterfly she kept in her pocket into discharge rooms for people who might need it, she said. The aftermath here wasn't a haunting so much as an unanswerable grace. Co-workers shared the story to highlight that not every unexplained moment in a hospital is frightening. Some are relief folded into the machinery of endings. 8. Basement whistle and moving bed. Hospital basements are where institutions hide their guts. Boilers, laundry, storage, rows of beds waiting for patients that never came back. A night maintenance worker told me about an evening when the deafening thrum of the boilers was punctured by someone whistling, a simple, tuneless whistle he recognized as his own. He paused because it was the exact cadence he used while folding sheets. Then a bed on casters started to roll by itself down the corridor. Not a little shudder. It moved like hands pushing at the footboard. Boxes slid from shelves, metal clattered, and the industrial lights flickered. He felt a brush across his arm as if someone had passed him by. When he turned, there was no one. He sprinted for the stairwell and found the laundry manager already standing there with a flashlight saying, "I just heard something knock the carts." The part that made this stick in his head was how the whistle copied him. People imitate sounds all the time in a building where the HVAC makes a choir of groans, pigeons, pipes, radio signals. But being mimicked in a place you think you own, in your own exact cadence, felt intimate and trespassing at once. 9. Pathology. Stair landing. This is one of the few accounts that made the staff quietly avoid a particular stairwell for months. A resident on late rounds in pathology took the service stairs by habit. Halfway down, he saw, in the dim emergency escape light, a small, grey shape sitting on the landing. He says it looked like the lower half of a child, a tiny pair of legs in a little dress, but the skin a waxy grey, the feet misshapen. The odour of rot that follows old things hit him like a physical wall. He ran and didn't stop until he reached the lab. Security logged it, because hospitals always log unusual access to non-public areas. Multiple people later said they'd felt uneasy in that stairwell, and one cleaning worker admitted she'd left early once because the smell became overwhelming for no reason. The thing about pathology areas is they are already repositories of endings. The presence of something that looked like a child in that liminal space upset people in a way that made them hush. They spoke of it in low voices, the way you talk about a storm that came through the night. There are plausible explanations. Old mannequins, forgotten props, a practical joke gone too far. But the accounts carried an extra detail. This thing had not moved like an object. It seemed to watch the resident until he looked away. After that night, the hospital placed motion lights in the stairwell and encouraged staff to avoid it alone at night. Interlude, 4 stories in, and the pattern starts to feel like a map. We've seen comfort and menace, mimicry, and the purely physical, the dramatic, and the small domestic impossibility. It's worth asking, why hospitals? Maybe because the boundaries are thin, maybe because so much of what happens there is a negotiation with things we don't understand. Maybe because machines and people mix in strange ways when the body starts to fail. If anything ties these accounts together so far, it's presence, familiar things arriving where they have no business being. A walker, a voice, a sister's face on shadow. The trick is not that things appear, it's how ordinary they look when they do. The more mundane the detail, the harder it is to write it off. 10. The historic uniformed man. This one comes from a mother who had moved into a military town with her toddler. On slow Sundays, she would walk the hospital corridors, old bay windows and a plaque commemorating a bygone ward, because it felt safer than being at home with a restless child. Her son, 5, tugged at her sleeve and pointed, "Look, Mama, the man with the hat says hello." A gentleman in an out-of-time uniform stood by the stairwell and tipped an invisible hat, smiling. The mother approached, and the man tipped again, and then simply dissolved into the light like a smear. Years later, paging through an old yearbook of the base hospital, the mother found a photograph that matched his jacket and the angle of his hat. This story isn't about terror. The child's reaction was delight, but it's about time folding. The child's visitation suggests a patience to these things. They occupy corners, wait, and sometimes only reveal themselves to new eyes that still see the world as full of people who might be friendly. The mother framed a picture of that man for a while, more as a memory than an explanation. 11. Cleaner, peeking woman, and shirt grab. Housekeeping staff hear everything, and sometimes they are the only witnesses to things that happen between the night's rooms. One cleaner told me about a long, slow night walking the administrative wing. She passed a conference room and thought she saw a pale woman peering out from behind the frosted glass. The cleaner stopped, and the figure vanished. A half-hour later, as she rounded a corner, something grabbed the back hem of her shirt, 2 fingers, a light, insistent pull, like a child asking to be led across the floor. She spun around and no one was there. Her radio crackled to life, and she told the security officer what had happened. He shrugged and said, "Lots of people get touched." The cleaner didn't laugh. She took the rest of the night slow, rolled the cart gently, and kept her hand on the radio. Physical contact complicates these stories in a way that voices alone don't. When people feel a tug or a brush, their reports change tone. They become more concrete, more defensive. Staff say it happens enough that the line between weird and work hazard blurs. The cleaner didn't stop working, but she never walked that corridor alone again. 12. Cardiac wing, help me voice. An experienced nurse in the cardiac unit told of a night when she was checking charts and heard a child's voice cry, "Help me," from behind the curtain of the next bed. She called out and shook the curtain aside. No child, no bed, only an empty curtain rail that twitched in the stale air. She later learned that a nearby patient had been delirious earlier and had been hearing things, which made it easier for the staff to catalogue the occurrence as an artifact of medicine. Yet there's an edge to these nights. The same nurse admitted that after years on the floors, she thought less about the identity of the voice and more about the human reaction to it, the automatic lift of someone who is trained to answer calls for help. Whether the cry came from a patient's mind, a trick of acoustics, or a visitor from elsewhere, someone went to that curtain because it sounded like need. Hospitals teach you to respond before you reason. 13. Cafeteria restroom darkness. Older wings are full of small, mechanical eccentricities. One evening, a janitor in the old cafeteria hall was cleaning when he walked past the restroom and heard the click of the light switch from inside. He looked through the window and saw the stall light go out, though there was no one standing at the door and no sign of anyone having entered the room. He turned the sign, knocked, and then the lights came back on. The surveillance camera showed a clean, empty stall the whole time. It's a simple manipulation of the physical environment, but the idea of a switch flipping on its own in a place full of late-night foot traffic unsettles people because it implies intention. The janitor later admitted he would avoid that restroom after midnight, remarking that in a hospital, even the small mundane things feel like they're watching you back. 14. Night shift, child laughter, and the running girl. You get used to footsteps in hospitals, the shuffling of shoes, the quick feet of interns, the heavy tread of security. But multiple night shift staff at a mid-sized urban hospital began reporting the same sound over months. Little, bare feet hitting tile, a child's laugh that echoed down corridors that should have been empty. Security checked the cameras, the stairwells, storage closets. Nothing. Some staff remembered the sound as almost fond. Nurses would say, "She likes to run at 2 a.m., as if making a note about a colleague's habit. Others were less comfortable. The laughter tended to be the sort that made the skin tighten, high, breathy, with a trailing echo as if there were too many spaces for it to fit into. The stories joined together. Cleaning staff who saw a flash of movement, a physician who once stopped to call, "Hey, kiddo," and got no answer, co-workers sharing the same uneasy smile over coffee. Over time, the running girl became part of the hospital's night folklore, sometimes a comfort, sometimes a chill. 15. Security patrol footsteps, roof and parking garage incident. Security officers are among the most practical witnesses, trained, skeptical, and physically present in the building's more exposed spaces. A seasoned patrolman told me about a night walk on the roof. He and a rookie were doing their rounds, checking doors. The rookie reported hearing sprinting footsteps pass him, right to left, across the roof. The senior officer looked up and saw nothing. When they checked the cameras, the footage showed no one on the roof. Yet a second camera from a lower floor registered a motion blur crossing the yard at an impossible speed. The same patrolman later found a roof door left unlocked that he was sure he had secured. He kept a log, the sort of dry documentation officers make in the name of liability. But the entry for that night was marked with a small, unusual line in the margins. Possibly other patrols present. For someone whose world is measured in doors, locked and unlocked, the idea that the building had other patrols, other bodies moving through it, was disconcerting. He started doubling up on his patrols for a while, not out of fear so much as a professional unwillingness to let a mystery go unresolved. At this point, the hallway outside the security office feels like a line on a map where different kinds of presence converge. Children, old women, shadows, the mimicry of loved ones. Each story skews towards something different: comfort, menace, physical tangibility, but all of them argue for the same small thesis. Hospitals are places where the rules thin out just enough for the unexplained to slip in. 16. Laundry room, voice and footsteps. A nurse's aide who worked nights told of a morning when they swore they heard footsteps in the locked laundry room. The door required a passcode to open and would clang loudly if anyone used the back entrance. Someone called from the hallway, "You okay in there?" And there was a voice answering, faint, as if through a thick wall. The aide peeled off their gloves, opened the door, and found the room empty. There was no sign of forced entry and no tracks on the dust-covered floor. What made this one uncomfortable was the acoustic impossibility. The helper pointed out how sound travels in hospitals, and that voice wasn't echoing. It was boxed and specific, like a person standing behind the dryer. The passcode logs showed no access. For days afterwards, the aide would pause at the door, listen for any human breathing. She started carrying an extra set of laundry tags in her pocket, small talismans, she said, because sometimes the only thing that works in a building filled with things you can't explain is the small business of holding on to something familiar. 17. Abandoned hospital followed inside. It was a late summer dusk when a group of teenagers trespassed into an abandoned wing that had once been a community hospital. They were not there to vandalize. They wanted to explore shutters and staircases, the kind of thing kids do when a place is quietly dangerous. One of them left the group to climb a stairwell and said later he felt a presence behind him, longer than a breath, and followed a dark figure up 2 flights. He reached what he thought was the roof and texted his friend, only to get a reply, "We're still at the skate park. Where are you?" He ran back down and found the group in the dim lot, faces white in the last light. No one had followed him. They left fast, and in the car he realized his phone battery was at nearly full, though he hadn't charged it. He couldn't explain how he had lost 20 minutes. Stories like this have clear warnings attached to them. Trespass is dangerous. In retelling, people emphasize that point. But the core of the account is the feeling of being guided. Pulled upstairs by an unseen insistence, offered an exit you hadn't planned for. Whatever took interest in that group that night was not content to remain outside the building any more than the others had been content to remain outside the hospital itself. The end of part 1, but not the end of the building. We've made it through 17 accounts, each of them a different corridor in the same strange map. Some of these ended with consolation, people feeling watched over. Others ended with questions and locked doors. The one thing they all share is that they resist being neatly explained. A hospital is designed to measure and to mend, and yet its structure, beds, curtains, stairwells, creates the perfect scaffolding for things that defy measurement. Up ahead are the evenings when staff learn to say, "That happens," without irony. There are corridors where laughter and weeping can blend into the same sound. There are basements that imitate your whistle and stairwells that host things that look like children. For all the charts and the monitoring, the human instinct is still to react, to pull back a curtain, to check an empty stall, to tell someone in the break room over microwaved coffee. If you're still with me, you should know we're not done yet. There are more nights, more voices, and a few stories that dig into a different kind of unease. The sense that something in these buildings learns your rhythm and starts to keep time with you. In the next block, we'll circle back into wings that feel older than their bricks, into cases where multiple witnesses confirm the impossible, and into moments when the hospital itself seems to be remembering someone it shouldn't. There's a strange afterlife to certain nights in a hospital, the ones that refuse to fold cleanly into the logbook. You leave an incident report, you tell a supervisor, you rehearse the line you'll say when someone asks. Then the thing keeps visiting you in ways that paperwork can't touch. You'll find it in the pause between monitors, in the damp shadow under a vending machine, in the way the fluorescent hum seems to gather itself into a voice when you're alone. That's what people told me after the tape checks and the morning coffee and the mandatory counseling sessions. The moments that mattered were never the sharp, headline-ready freakouts. They were the small accommodations you made to keep doing the work. A nurse from one of those older wards told me that after the Vanishing Walker incident, people started noticing things disappearing in other, less dramatic ways. A favorite pen would be left on a counter and then not be there when someone returned. Gloves folded into neat squares would end up scattered across a bed. A visitor's stuffed animal placed on a chair would be found on the adjacent windowsill as if someone had wanted the child to have a view. No single one of these things proved anything. They added up like weather, though, little atmospheric shifts that eventually made staff say, half joking and wholly wary, "Yeah, this place rearranges itself." That rearrangement can have a practical consequence. A surgical tech told me about the night before a big case when an instrument tray that had been counted and sealed was later found with one clamp missing. The team swore they'd locked the tray. They searched, they recounted. The OR manager cursed and blamed the night shift for everything. The missing clamp turned up weeks later, tucked under a supply closet door. Nobody could explain how it had gotten there. They didn't blame a ghost. Who could afford that joke? But the mood in the suite shifted. People double-checked counts in a way that felt a finger tapping at the back of their minds. The tall man who watched Joe became less of a single-image legend and more of a pattern after a few months. Staff on hospice wings began reporting in the same resigned tone they used for call bells left hanging. Occasional sightings of height at the end of beds. Once, two nursing assistants on opposite sides of a corridor both stopped, pointed, and said, "There." They called security. Security came and saw nothing. It's one thing to write "patient anxious" on a chart. It's another to see a shadow that 3 different people punctuated with the same word, tall. The tall things are never chatty, never terribly detailed. They read like posture, the way someone stands when they're not in a hurry to leave. There are practical effects that reach into people's lives. The maintenance guy, who heard his own whistle in the basement, started sleeping in his lounge with the radio on because the mimicry felt like a secret that knew him. The cleaner, who had her shirt tugged, carried a safety pin in her pocket for months, small, clumsy armor for the hands that had no owner. A security officer who found the roof door unlocked logged extra patrols, not out of superstition, but because his job gave him a place to channel unease into routine. Rituals form quickly in hospitals. Where there's fear, people build habits to counter it. Extra checks, flashlights in pockets, coffee drinkers who refuse to switch off the kitchen light. And then there are the offers of comfort that push the other way. The stories of Nonny and Papu, the ICU butterflies, the fever visit from Kay. These are not the parts people always want to hear in a horror list. They complicate the genre. A mother, smoothing a child's hair in the middle of a night that no one knew she should be there, is not designed to frighten. When staff share those moments, there's a softness to their voices, an almost tender pride that a building that bears illness can also hold consolation. I met a respiratory therapist who'd been called practical and cynic by colleagues for years, someone who made light of murmurs and saccharine stories. He tells this story differently now, quieter. He was transferring a patient late, a middle-aged man with lungs that sounded like old corn cribs. The patient looked off to the side and said, without any malice, "They're singing." The therapist, used to oxygen deprivation hallucinations, expected the patient to name a radio station or a memory. Instead, the man described a room full of voices, harmonizing without words, and then he smiled in a way that no one had seen him smile since being admitted. That man left the next morning without complications. The therapist kept the memory of that smile because it implied there are visits that belong less to menace and more to mercy. This tension, comfort and threat sitting across the same aisle, is the heartbeat of hospital hauntings. The liminal nature of the place makes both more plausible. A corridor can host a lullaby and a menace in the same breath. To staff, that ambiguity becomes normal enough to joke about. To family, it becomes a talisman or a terror. To the person who experiences it, it is often both. Several people I spoke with returned again and again to the idea of voices that called for help, sounds that tug at someone trained to respond. A nurse in cardiac said something that stuck with me. If you work here long enough, you learn to run before you ask why. That instinct is the engine that keeps the place functioning, but it can also be how strange things root themselves in the workflow. A voice that says help will get you moving, and action often buries the memory of how you felt a moment before. You turn the curtain, you check the bed, you answer the alarm, and you tell your story in language softened by professional distance. Patient delirious, no sign of admission, no record in security log. The final sentence, the part that gets whispered over coffee, is almost always the one that gets saved. Still, we heard it. Not all corroboration is neat. Cameras fail at the crucial edges, the slats of stalls, the gloom under stairwells, the narrow angle of a corridor. One facility ran footage after an unexplainable mattress-rolling incident in the basement and found only the static that sometimes floods older feeds. The soundtrack picked up a whistle, but the camera showed empty space. For maintenance personnel who live and work by visual confirmation, it's a strange thing to have your ears insist on a presence that your eyes refuse to corroborate. The stairwell where a resident saw the little grey shape became a place of quiet dread. Managers put up motion-activated lights. The lights worked, but the staff report remained the same. The feeling of being watched there persisted. That's the odd power of these places. Their architecture enforces narratives. Stairwells, basements, curtain-separated beds, places where bodies move from one state to another. These are the scaffolds ghosts prefer, according to the law. Whether anything supernatural actually prefers them is a separate question. The point, the people told me, is that the building gives shape to the stories they tell each other. I want to show you why the mimicry stories are some of the most unnerving. The nurse who saw the shadow with her sister's face told me in careful sentences what her mother had always said about evil taking the shape of the familiar. She laughed a small, private laugh when she remembered how absurd she felt saying Jesus' name aloud to a dark silhouette in her father's room. That night followed her like an echo. She took time off. She watched old home videos for reassurance of what faces truly looked like. On the third week after the event, another nurse reported the same thing. A dark shape at a doorway, with a face that looked like someone who'd left the building years ago. Two independent accounts in the same unit break through the usual privacy. They force a different kind of talk in the break room, not jokes, but inventories. Who do we know who's died? Who would this thing be imitating if it was imitating anyone at all? The mimicry leaks into personal grief. Families start asking whether a late-night visitation was a comfort or a trick. Staff harden in ways that aren't always healthy. They learn to mistake tenderness for threat and vice versa. Sometimes multiple witnesses do line up in ways that refuse easy dismissal. After the Vanishing Walker event, a small group of visitors and staff stood across the hall, waiting for cameras to be reviewed again until the security footage produced that uncanny blank frame. They watched that blank with the feeling of looking at a photograph where someone had been rubbed out. The blankness became an argument. What in the world erases presence between frames? The white noise of the fluorescent hum filled the silence like an accusation. A chaplain I spoke with, someone whose job is to stand where the living and the dying meet, had a different angle on these things. He described the hospital like a congregation of thresholds. People come here to finish, to begin, to cross, he said. When I get a call at midnight, half the time, it's ordinary grief. The other half, it's something that feels like an interruption of heaven or hell, depending on who you ask. He didn't use the word ghost much. He used presence. That choice of language matters. A presence can be anything from an old nurse's habit to a card-carrying apparition. The chaplain's observations connect to the stories of Nonny and the ICU butterflies, the comfort visits that feel like a benediction. Not everyone interprets comforting appearances as benevolent. A social worker who'd spent decades in psych consults told me about a patient who repeatedly described being visited by smiling relatives who told him to go with them. The social worker worried that acceptance of such narratives might prevent necessary interventions. There is a clinical and ethical line here. If a patient finds solace in a visitation, do you correct them? The answer tends to fold into pastoral judgment. Most care providers will not forcibly contradict a dying person's claimed vision if it eases their passage. That practice sits uneasily with others who worry about precision in care. There are two kinds of practical worry that cropped up across interviews. The first is the risk of normalization. Staff becoming so used to oddities that they fail to notice when a genuinely dangerous human behavior needs addressing. The second is the burden placed on workers' mental health. People who work nights, who interface with grief constantly, accumulate strange memories that don't always slot neatly into therapy sessions or HR forms. Some told me they cope by sharing stories in controlled doses. The break room gossip becomes a therapy of sorts. Laughter lightens it. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they place an extra flashlight on the nightstand. Every now and then, a story shows that the hospital itself can be a character with memory. A veteran porter described a stretch of corridor that remembered certain nights, the route, the time, the shape. He would wheel a bed down that hall, and at a certain tile seam, the lights would flicker, always in the same rhythm. He stopped asking why and started choosing routes that avoided the seam when he could. The seam had no explanation he could get from electricians. The building, in his telling, had preferences. Whether that preference was an emergent property of wiring or something else, he couldn't say. He only knew that he learned to listen to the building's small cues because they were cheaper to obey than to fight. Sometimes the most disturbing moments are the ones that erase time. The teen who trespassed and felt himself followed into an abandoned wing returned to the world with a gap on his phone that did not fit the hours he remembered. Memory loss in these tales is not always violent. It's confounding. People go up 2 flights and suddenly cannot account for 20 minutes. The notion of being guided, led by something unseen into spaces you thought you controlled, taps into a deep fear, the loss of agency. That fear is louder than any scream. I asked several people whether belief or doubt changed what they saw. The answers were messy. One housekeeper confessed she was agnostic until her mother died, and a woman in the ER, who looked like Nana, smoothed her hair. She became afterward someone who brought a small rosary in the pocket of her scrubs. A surgeon who prides himself on empirical proof told me he once felt a child's hand slip into his glove while he scrubbed for a routine case, and the memory of that touch made him less dismissive at 10 p.m. One security officer, who had never been spiritual in his life, came home one night and locked every door 3 times because he had watched something move across the roof as if it were walking a different patrol. For many, the work of belief is private and incremental. A touch here, a vanished walker there, a camera that refuses to show what ears insist on hearing. I remember a woman in transport who told me something quiet and terrible. She had been driving a patient family between wings for weeks. Visits, palliative conferences, midnight coffees, and one night a man in a dated uniform stepped into the elevator and bowed. It was the same man, she later learned, who had been photographed in the old yearbook. She said the bow felt like a courtesy from another time, a recognition of service that transcended the building's renovations. For her, the history in the hospital wasn't hostile. It was a seam that allowed an older etiquette to slip through. She kept telling the story because she liked that the hospital, in that moment, preserved a human gesture. But not all gestures are polite. The mimicry of a sister's face emphasized in some interviews the ease with which grief can be manipulated. People told me about the ethical tightrope, how to comfort a patient who believes they are seeing a loved one when family members want evidence, or when the family itself feels haunted. The stories don't tend to conclude with a neat arbitration. They stay open-ended, like a sentence without a period. People live with the ambiguity because they have to. The hospital's rhythm keeps moving. At its worst, the presence of the unexplained can seed paranoia. A junior doctor who once prided himself on rationality told me he found himself checking scan rooms and storage closets at odd hours because his colleagues had begun reporting things. He'd walk the halls with headphones playing to drown out the hum of vents, and then realize that the devices he used to keep him sane were also the things that made him miss soft sounds. He quit those playlists eventually. He learned to move slowly, not out of fear, but because the building kept making him hurry toward things he couldn't return to. If there's a single motif in these stories, beyond liminality, it's the idea that hospitals are places of repeated returns. People come back in different forms, as visitors, as memories, as administrative ghosts that haunt the break room. That repetition builds a culture around the strange. A young nurse, who'd been the target of a practical joke that ended at 3 a.m., swore she felt a cold hand on her shoulder the next night. Another staff member, equally pragmatic, patted her back and said, "It happens." That phrase, said with a shrug in the staff room, counts as both comfort and menace. It normalizes the abnormal so staff can keep working. It also quiets the impetus to look deeper. And yet, when families tell these stories, they bring a different language. Grief, gratitude, seeking meaning. The student who credited Noni and Papu with sitting at her bed used those names like lit candles. They were not evidence, they were solace. For her family, that was enough. For staff, that solace sometimes became a point of tenderness. Sometimes it became something that required documentation. The hospital, by necessity, cultivates both practical skepticism and private tenderness at once. As the night stretches, some people find that the best response to the unexplained is a measure of gentleness. A nurse I spoke with would sometimes place a small origami bird on the rail of a bed after a hard night. She didn't tell people it was for the ghosts. She told them it was for anyone who might need to see something small and folded into something hopeful. The bird calmed families. It calmed her. Small gestures like that are a human counterweight to the eerie architecture of the place. There are also practical, institutional steps hospitals take when these things become too frequent to ignore. Security upgrades cameras, engineers check wiring, chaplains make rounds. At one hospital where incidents clustered near a certain wing, administrators commissioned a series of interviews and adjusted staffing patterns. The measures were, by design, secular and administrative: shift changes, better lighting, more security check-ins. Those interventions don't answer the questions the staff asks in the dark. They do, however, show how institutions adapt. They plug holes, tighten protocols, and attempt to make anomalies into tasks. All of this brings us to another kind of story, less a single incident than an accumulation that becomes a crescendo. Think of a unit where the vanishing walker happens in the morning. The shadow with sister face is reported at night, and in the basement, the maintenance man's whistle is mimicked. Imagine the staff in the break room comparing notes. That unit grew its own folklore. A person who worked there for 20 years told me that folklore acts as a map. People learn to avoid certain places at certain hours. They leave a light on in the linen closet. A particular night shift team started swapping stories over the microwave like an oral history. That shared memory becomes a kind of protective ritual, one built on acknowledgement rather than denial. The climax of these conversations often isn't a single terrifying image. It's the slow realization that all of these small incidents, things vanishing, voices behind curtains, hands that reach, shadows wearing familiar faces, do something to the people who witness them. They change how someone sees a ceiling tile, how they answer a call, how they tuck a patient's blanket. They rewrite habits, and habit is what hospitals depend on most. I want to close with what people told me they put in their pockets as a talisman. Not because talismans prove anything. They don't. They are artifacts of coping. The maintenance man held his whistle. The cleaner carried a safety pin. The ICU nurse kept a knitted butterfly in a pocket. The security officer kept a tighter set of patrol notes. The chaplain kept a soft, dog-eared Bible in the glove compartment. These objects are small, inexpensive, human. They underscore that the response to the unexplainable is often modest, extra light, an additional round of checks, a hand on a shoulder. If you spend nights in a hospital, you'll learn to speak the language of both care and mystery. Either will serve you. You will learn to answer a call for help even if the voice had no body. You will learn to respect comfort when it arrives in a stranger's shape. You may also learn to be careful with stories. Stories change people. They make the building alive with history and haunt memory the same way old wallpaper peels at the edges. That duality of compassion and caution, of routine and rupture, is what makes hospitals, for many who work in them, both sacred and uncanny. So what do we take away from these 17 accounts? Maybe nothing that certifies proof. Maybe everything that testifies to the human heart's need for meaning. Hospitals are not only bodies and machines. They are thresholds where people pass, where stories accumulate, where the ordinary and the extraordinary meet in easy proximity. If anything haunts a hospital, it's not one thing. It's the accumulation of all those unquiet nights, those small returns, those mismatched memories and comforting visitations that resist tidy explanation. If you found yourself unsettled or oddly comforted by any of these stories, you're not alone. These narratives exist precisely because they do what hospitals do best: hold what matters until someone can be there to answer. And sometimes, when a light flickers or a curtain breathes, that someone is not in a name or a title we understand. Thanks for sitting with these stories. If you want to hear more accounts like these, consider subscribing, hit the like button, and ring the bell so you don't miss future uploads. Share this with someone who likes to read the spaces between beeps. Until next time, keep a small light on and listen for the soft things hospitals say when they think no one is watching.